This week and next week, you'll be reading The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. It's a very big book. Do you guys have it? It's a big book. You're only going to be reading a fraction of it, okay? And so the problem for me is to try to talk about the book in such a way that you get a sense for the whole thing while you only actually are reading, a small portion of it. So this book is important for us. It's an important way to understand the ancient Greek world. If you're someone like Brad here, you're interested in particular aspects of the Greek world. If you're not like Brad, though, and if you're interested in more kind of broader issues about human existence, about the human condition, about the kind of ideals that we have and live by, this book is also important. Okay, it has a lot to say about those types of things. It has a lot to say to us as individuals, and it has a lot to say to us about politics. So who was Thucydides? Here we see Thucydides in the Royal Ontario Museum. First of all, he was an Athenian. He was from Athens. He lived in the 5th century BC. And he wrote a book that recounts a war between Athens and Sparta that occurred during his lifetime. So on one level, the purpose of his history was to explain what happened. And so if you want to know what happened in the war, you can read this book and you get a pretty good account of it. Who won, who lost, so on and so forth. Many historians, however, examine the past in order to uncover something of a kind of deeper reality. They want to find out about the forces and circumstances that shaped particular events. So the question for us is, what is Thucydides telling us in this history? He says, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." This is quite a claim, okay, to write something that will last forever. And, we need to ask ourselves, how can an account of a war that happened 2,500 years ago have any meaning or relevance for us today? Wars happen all the time. We know a little about Thucydides, really about all we know. Oops. Yeah. Okay, we know a little about Thucydides beyond what he tells us about himself. And so in his very first sentence, he talks about himself. He says, "Thucydides, the Athenian, wrote the history of the war between Athens and Sparta." If only the book were so simple. As I said, he was an Athenian. He lived in the 5th century BC, but he was not an ordinary Athenian. He was wealthy. His family owned gold mines, we're told, in northern Greece. It's also important to note that he tells us in his history that during the war he served as a general in the Athenian army. Okay? And he mentions, he was only 35 years old. Okay? He also mentions that when he was a general, he was ordered to defend the city of Amphipolis. There's Athens and Sparta. Okay. Amphipolis is in northern Greece. It's in Thrace. The city was a valuable location for its wealth. The gold mines are up there. Okay. Thucydides was assigned the military target of capturing the city. He failed to arrive in time to defend it against the Spartans, and consequently he was punished by the Athenian assembly. They dismissed him from the army, and he was sentenced to exile, which was a common punishment in the ancient Greek world. He was sentenced to exile from Athens until the end of the war. So he spent many of his years in exile at home, but he also took the opportunity of this forced retirement to write a history of the Peloponnesian War. And he traveled extensively, we're told, to interview participants in the conflict and to visit the various theaters of the war, including Thrace, and as far away as Sicily, Syracuse in Sicily, on the island of Sicily, where the outcome of the war was decided. He died in the year 400, while he was still working on Book 8 of his work. So the book you have is actually incomplete. He was in the middle of writing about the year 411, and so he had about 6 years or so to go in his narrative. Now, in order to understand Thucydides' book, it may be helpful to consider his intellectual background. Again, not much is known. In his history, here you can see the two sides. The Athens and Sparta are the leading cities, and they had leagues or alliances, the Delian League and the Peloponnesian League, that were at war in this conflict. Now, about Thucydides' background, we know he was a military officer. In his history, he says that he admires a man named Antiphon. Antiphon was a sophist and a politician. Other sources suggest that Thucydides studied with a man named Protagoras, who was also a sophist. Sophism, very briefly, was a prominent intellectual movement in 5th century Greece known for the use of rhetoric and argumentation. So one of its famous proponents, for example, said that, or made the claim that he could make the weaker argument the stronger simply through his use of rhetoric. Thucydides, however, seems not to have been interested in the usual benefits of sophism, which Plato, who you'll be reading in the next couple weeks, associated with the political ambitions of well-to-do young men who wanted to kind of reach the height of power in Athenian politics. But we can see the influence of sophism on Thucydides' writing in his rhetorical style, For example, he presents antithetical elements. Athens and Sparta as opposing representations of human character. Pericles and Cleon. Pericles as a principled leader, Cleon as a demagogue. Or when he talks about, when he relates political disputes, he presents speeches and he opposes them. He puts them standing side by side so you can contrast them. For example, in the debate at Sparta, a series of speeches, which is in your reading assignment, which was speeches that were given at the outset of the war, you as a reader can examine directly the conflicting arguments and points of view. So he uses a style, in fact, which allows you to kind of imagine more accurately what's going on. He uses this also in his narrative style. When he talks about, there's another part of your reading assignment, the funeral oration of Pericles. Pericles was a great Athenian statesman. There's Pericles, He was a great Athenian statesman and advocate of democracy who gives a very eloquent speech on the virtues of Athens, And so this speech is full of noble ideals, and it stands in really stark contrast to the absence of ideals in Thucydides' description of a plague epidemic that later ravaged the city. In the funeral oration, Pericles declaims to the Athenians, "What I would prefer is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens as she really is, and should fall in love with her. When you realize her greatness, then reflect that what made her great was men who were ashamed to fall below a certain standard." So when I talked about standards at the very beginning of my remarks today, what I'm referring to is this type of thing, Thucydides reminds us of these standards. The standard of Athens is based on the lawfulness of Athenians. Pericles continues, "We are free and tolerant in our private lives, but in public affairs we keep to the law. This is because it commands our deep respect. We give our obedience to those whom we put in positions of authority, and we obey the laws themselves, especially those which are the protection of the oppressed, and those unwritten laws which it is an acknowledged shame to break." So think about what those unwritten laws are. Are there any unwritten laws that affect us in our daily lives, that guide our behavior? Think about what Thucydides thinks about law, Immediately after this funeral oration of Pericles, the plague hits Athens, It dissolves this greatness, these Athenian virtues. Perhaps it dissolves those unwritten laws as well, And so when Thucydides talks about the plague in the section right after the oration, he says, "In other respects also, Athens owed to the plague the beginnings of a state of unprecedented lawlessness. As for what is called honor, no one showed himself willing to abide by its laws. So doubtful was it whether we would survive to enjoy the name of it. It was generally agreed that what was both honorable and valuable was the pleasure of the moment and everything that might conceivably contribute to that pleasure. No fear of God or law of man had a restraining influence, okay? So the plague, in effect, shatters Pericles' view. Thucydides is putting them side by side intentionally, okay? What can we understand from that? What's his intent there? Thucydides' opposition of the two, was it an attack on Pericles? Is he criticizing Pericles? Is he criticizing Athenian virtue? You can talk about that in your class. It's clear, however, that what he's doing is he's putting them side by side, and perhaps he's allowing us to see something a little deeper, okay? What you might call these realities that are kind of below the surface. The tensions underlying civic virtue, the fragility of the standards of human character, okay? These types of things. Thucydides, whatever his background, and as I said, we don't know much about it, he seems to have had a remarkable ability to observe the connections between the individual and the world that the Greeks lived in, which we can use as a kind of almost a mirror for our own lives and the world we live in. The author of the History of the Peloponnesian War, as I said, was an Athenian. He served as a general in the Greek army, in the Athenian army. He was then removed from command for failure in that war, and he was punished. Then he wrote a history of that war that he fought in. In other words, you might expect him to write a grossly biased account of the war, one that favors one side over the other. And moreover, he claims that his history will be relevant for all time. So if his method of history might be matched, and I'll talk about that next, his confidence would certainly be hard to beat. Okay, so is he acting out of hubris? What was he trying to do here? For Thucydides, history meant a systematic inquiry into contemporary events. So you can think of the title not as a history of the Peloponnesian War, but inquiry into the Peloponnesian War. He had little patience for the interest his predecessors like Herodotus showed in the romantic elements of the stories that they recorded. His criticism of Herodotus and others is indirect, but it certainly is clear that he considered the historical method used by them to be entirely inadequate. Okay? He says, the rest of the Hellenes, too, make many incorrect assumptions not only about the dimly remembered past, but also about contemporary history. Most people, in fact, will not take trouble in finding out the truth, but are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear. Thucydides concerned himself only with contemporary events, and his approach to doing history rested on the conviction that little can be known of the distant past. So why are we reading this book? He writes, I have found it impossible because of its remoteness in time to acquire a really precise knowledge of the distant past or even of the history preceding our own period. However, his historical method and principles and his ability to distinguish what's important certainly proves to us today that much can be learned from the past, okay? What about his historical method? He avoided discussion of myths and gods. What have you read about so far in CS, in this semester? Lots of myths and gods, right? Well, say goodbye to all that. The supernatural for Thucydides had no part to play in his analysis of human affairs. Politics and society were subjects to be regarded with skepticism. He states that all evidence should be tested for accuracy, okay? So he says, I've made it a principle not to write down the first story that came my way and not even to be guided by my own general impressions, okay? I've checked with as much thoroughness as possible the stories that he's heard. He says that the accuracy of his evidence was further enhanced by his development of a chronological scheme, okay, in which to place his data, his historical data. So there was no calendar, so he had to figure out a way to organize time. And so he did this. He devised a system in which he measured time from the first year of the war, okay, divided by summer and winter. And then he put his data into that scheme. Thus, his array of verified information, always verified, is placed within a proper context, and this allowed for the possibility of an effective interpretation of the historical evidence. So then he can distinguish primary causes from secondary causes. Political and military events often take on a kind of superficial quality, that is, those things that we call facts, events that take place, okay? These start to appear only as kind of symptoms of a disease, some have said, reflecting a deeper reality that's much more important, okay? So he's looking beyond the surface. He's going past the surface into something deeper. A lot is made of Thucydides' method, okay? Remember, however, that his method is tempered by his particular view. When Thucydides refers to reasonable accuracy, that's a quote, reasonable accuracy, or truest causes, okay? We're reminded that we're reading his interpretation of the war just as we read his careful interpretation of the speeches that he reports to us in such detail. Okay, so he presents these speeches as if they had been recorded for him, and then he simply transcribed them. And he says, he's very candid about it. He says, I found it very difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speeches say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation. Okay? So it's actually coming through kind of the filter of his brain. Herodotus recreated the atmosphere of the past. For Thucydides, this wasn't enough. Okay? Thucydides' historical method forms a narrative that contains arguments, interpretations, founded on the belief that our knowledge of the past is useful because we can understand it from all sides. We can see the difference between the profound and the superficial, between symptoms and disease. It's important to discern those differences. His intellectual acuity may have been sharpened by sophistic training, but by our reading between the lines, we get the sense that his historical method was guided by a moral conviction, okay, that ran as deep as those realities that he was trying to bring to the surface. By means of understanding history, Thucydides believed we could make better political judgments. And aren't political judgments really moral judgments? So, what does the book consist of? The book apparently consists of these arguments or interpretations that I talked about. When we see the inquiry into the Peloponnesian War as an account of the past that includes interpretations and convictions, it becomes clear that the book contains a number of arguments. One might consider it a treatise on historiography. Historiography is the study of historical method. So he argues that his evidence is more reliable than, he says, that of the poets like Homer, for example, who exaggerate the importance of their themes, or of the prose chroniclers like Herodotus. If you were to take CS 201 in a different semester, you would be reading Herodotus, perhaps, who are less interested in telling the truth than in catching the attention of their public, whose authorities cannot be checked. This method formed the foundation for additional arguments. So, in the past, the Persian War had been considered the greatest war, especially by Herodotus. But Thucydides argued that the war between Athens and Sparta was the greatest war of all time, as he expresses it, more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. And he gives reasons for this claim. It lasted a long time, 27 years, okay? He says, never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Never such loss of life, both in the actual warfare and in internal revolutions. This destruction, and this is what's making this war so worth writing about, this destruction, the destruction wrought by humanity was followed by upheaval in the natural world, violent earthquakes, eclipses, drought, famine, plague, all these calamities fell together upon the Hellenes after the outbreak of the Great War. At yet another level, the main thesis of Thucydides' history is that the power and greatness of Athens was a result of its development of navigation and commerce. The Athenian navy enabled the city to accumulate wealth, and this was the foundation of its empire, okay? So here, this is a kind of political level of understanding. On the immediate causes of the war, Thucydides related in great detail the complaints of the two sides against each other, okay? That is the Athenians and Spartans, or the leaders of the Delian and the Peloponnesian leagues. So he relates these, their arguments against each other. and the clash of their interests. But those superficial causes obscured the real reason for the war, imperial ambition. Thucydides argues that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. In many respects, his historical argument has even a wider reach, in part because of his method, which I've already mentioned, okay? Enough about that. But also, more significantly, as with many thinkers of his era, his vision rested on the conviction that moral issues and conflicts were an integral element in politics. So the history of the Peloponnesian War is not strictly a story of the conflict of these two cities, although that provides kind of the meat of the book. The story runs deeper. It's the story of moral conflicts experienced by human character, or the story of the strengths and weaknesses of individuals and societies to understand forces that are usually difficult to comprehend, okay? Just as Athenian democracy failed to comprehend the implications of its imperial ambition, okay? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. This wider understanding underlies his entire effort. It will be enough for me, he says, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past and which human nature, being what it is, will at some time or other, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. So the principles of his method and his vision of Hellenic history enable a deeper understanding of human affairs. According to Thucydides, human nature, being what it is, makes such an understanding absolutely imperative. And implicitly, I think, human nature also makes understanding possible. Think about, when Thucydides uses this expression, human nature, what does he mean by it? Okay, the elements of the conflict. We'll talk a little bit about culture and economics and politics and things like that. So, if his main thesis deals with the history of imperial ambition, and his approach to history is founded on moral convictions, how do these elements relate to each other? One way to get at this is to start to untangle the various strands of the conflict. Okay? At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Greece wasn't unified. It's all divided up. It consists of city-states and villages, and all their inhabitants are speaking different dialects of Greek. They all share a common heritage in history and poetry. Okay, so they're all reading or hearing Homer being recited, but they all have slightly different ways of talking and carrying on their daily lives. These various small states shared a distinct sense that they were Greek, okay, so there's something that brings them together, but then they also have their differences. And the one thing that brings them together is their differences from everyone who doesn't speak Greek, foreigners, barbarians. In spite of this common identity, however, Thucydides informs us that there existed a variety of differences among the Greek city-states. In particular, there were fundamental differences in these various areas of life, in economics and culture and so on and so forth. So the inhabitants of Athens and Sparta spoke two different dialects of Greek. The Athenians were Ionians, and the Spartans were Dorians. They had different customs and traditions, okay? Although these differences seem superficial, the cultural divide between the Athenians and the Spartans ran perhaps a little deeper, okay? Just as Sparta was landlocked in the middle of the Peloponnesus, okay, the Peloponnesian Peninsula down there, it also isolated itself from cultural change. There it is. The Spartan educational system helped them field the most disciplined and effective army in the Hellenic world, and it also helped them resist the new intellectual attitudes represented by sophism and the new learning that was coming over ancient Greece. Athens, on the other hand, is well connected to the sea, okay? It has a port of Piraeus, and it has good connections across the Mediterranean. And it then is receptive. It's not surprising that it was receptive to all sorts of innovation and was open to Greece's intellectual and artistic revolution. The speeches at the debate at Sparta, which is one of the sections in your assignment, suggest to us that the gulf was so deep between them that the conflict was practically inevitable. It's the Corinthians, okay, from people from another city who are pointing out these differences to these two sides. The Corinthians say, an Athenian is always an innovator, quick to form a resolution and quick at carrying it out. You Spartans, on the other hand, are good at keeping things as they are. You never originate an idea, okay? Your action tends to stop short of its aim, okay? So the Athenians, on the one hand, are decisive and quick to action. The Spartans are, slow and kind of deliberate about any action that they will take. The war between Athens and Sparta was as much a conflict of cultures, okay, as it was a war of politics. Another major difference between Athens and Sparta concerned their economic circumstances. The Spartans in the middle of the Peloponnesian Peninsula were self-sufficient in food. Consequently, the city was rich in agricultural resources but poor in money. Athens, in contrast, had too little farmland to support its population, and it relied extensively on seaborne commerce to supply its needs in food and timber for all those ships. Aside from its mineral wealth, Athens was a thriving commercial center, so it had access to a steady income, and it was further enriched by money collected from the member cities in the alliance it led. It was this wealth that enabled Athens to build the Parthenon and these wonderful monuments that you can see in Athens. It was this these monumental buildings are not so much a reflection of Athenian democracy as they are a reflection of the imperial strength of Athens. The political constitutions of these two states were radically different as well. Sparta possessed a form of government that had served as a stable basis for the Spartan regime for centuries. It consisted of elements of monarchy and aristocracy, so kind of conservative elements that kind of keep the political structure in place. Sparta's agricultural domain was worked by a conquered people called the Helots, who outnumbered the Spartans and were liable to rebel if Sparta showed any sign of weakness, or if the political elite showed any signs of weakness. And to prevent this from happening, the Spartans relied on a stable government and a very rigid educational system to provide a powerful land-based military. In contrast to Sparta, Athens, after more than a century of political upheaval, established a democracy. The citizens of Athens, and of course, citizen here does not mean women and does not mean slaves, so the free men only. All of these people, as citizens, could participate in the public affairs of Athens. In the view of Thucydides, and he was not a radical proponent of democracy, the proper functioning of Athenian democracy depended on the quality of its leading citizens. This is where virtue and character and these standards that I talked about at the beginning, that I referred to at the beginning, enter the picture. So he says of Pericles, because of his position, intelligence, and his known integrity, Pericles could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check. So in what was nominally a democracy, power was really in the hands of the first citizen. But the collective citizenry could vote, and thus the city's policy could change quickly to suit their wishes. Because an effective speaker could easily sway the assembly, so remember the rhetorical skills promoted by sophism, an effective speaker could sway the assembly of citizens. Men who lacked virtue used their influence to manipulate the citizens of Athens. So for Thucydides, I can't find a bust of Cleon to show you. For Thucydides, Cleon was perhaps the most notorious of these demagogues, one who would exploit popular prejudices or passions for his own political gain, his own personal gain, for the violence of his character, to quote Thucydides, and his influence over the citizens of Athens. It was the powerful influence of demagogues like Cleon that made the political life of a democracy like Athens so precarious. Indeed, perhaps any democracy. Thucydides' opposition of men like Pericles and Cleon, men of virtuous character, as opposed to men who have no virtues, gives us a hint that he was arguing that goodness and virtue may have been at stake in this war. So these various features, cultural, economic, political, of these two city-states shaped their respective imperial characters. To go back to the Athens-Sparta dichotomy. While Sparta oppressed a subject population at home, the various states within its Peloponnesian League could act with considerable independence. The League's political and military decisions tended to be slow, expressed in the opinion of the Corinthians and the debate at Sparta. Okay. Athens, in contrast, was ruthless and characteristically quick to lord it over its so-called allies, to the extent, perhaps, that Athenian democracy counted for nothing beyond its walls. Any kind of modern resonance there? Athenian imperial ambition grew out of its powerful political position at the end of the preceding war with Persia. Remember, the one that Herodotus thought was the greatest war. The growth of Athenian power, Thucydides argued, endangered Sparta's political security, and the gradual realization of Athenian imperial ambitions upset the balance of power between the two sides. The pressures built to such a degree that diplomatic maneuvering against weaker neutral states triggered the armed conflict. Thucydides showed that in an imperial world, the political neutrality of places like Milos, described in the Melian dialogue, could mean as little as Athenian democracy, and simply a prelude to their destruction. So these wonderful, poor people on these beautiful beaches got tangled up in this mess. In this respect, Thucydides was realistic in his depiction, but this recognition should not obscure his ideals, I think. So, lots of kind of different levels of argument and lots of historical information. I think when you read this, you need to look for big ideas. Okay, you can't, if you try to kind of absorb all the detailed information, you might get kind of stuck in the mire. So you need to look for themes, perhaps. That's the best way to read this book, or at least parts of this book, fairly quickly. Empire and ambition. Okay, justice, noble purpose. How do all these things kind of fit together? We know that this is a story of war between Athens and Sparta, yeah, but what was at the center of the conflict? Okay, what's at stake? Just a little bit about the war itself. Okay. After telling you to read for themes, I'll give you some more historical structure. There's 10 years of war, followed by 7 years of a quasi-peace, kind of a not very happy peace, and then another 10 years of war. Okay. After this long period of time, and an opportunity, in fact, especially during the quasi-peace, an opportunity for Athens to comprehend the consequences of its policy, Thucydides shows that Athens failed to see the implications of its ambition. He mourns the general deterioration of Greek character, of character throughout the Greek world. He mourns what he calls the simple way of looking at things. Okay? Pericles, the Athenian leader at the outset of the war, was an imperialist, okay? But a man apparently of considerable virtue. He recognized that Athens' strength lay in its sea power, and so he employed this strategy to avoid fighting the Spartans on land. Of course, the Spartans have a very strong army. Already in the first phase of the war, the demands of empire and the effects of war had manifested themselves, and what began as political ambition quickly degenerated into moral collapse. Within 2 years of the start of the conflict, Athens was ravaged by plague, the effect of which was exacerbated by the numerous Athenian refugees who sought shelter in Athens. Pericles' plan ensured a prolonged war. Okay? The stalemate offered no possibility of a clear resolution. Athens is conceding the land to Sparta. Sparta is conceding the sea to Athens. These are two powerful states. Okay? Neither side will be able to gain the upper hand. It'll be a contest of endurance. Within 3 years of the start of the conflict, Athens' allies rebelled, as Mytilene did. There's Mytilene, okay, and this is on the island of Lesbos, which is just off the coast of Turkey. This was a matter of grave concern to the Athenians, since the Mytileneans had a very large fleet. So the Athenians wanted this big batch of ships. The issue of how to resolve the Mytilenean problem was debated by the Athenians. So someone like Cleon, for example, felt compelled to make an example of Mytilene. And you make an example of them by killing all of Mytilene's male citizens, and you enslave all their women and children. Okay? A very good solution to keep in mind. This was actually a fairly common practice among the Greeks. Cleon argued, punish them as they deserve and make an example of them to your other allies, plainly showing that revolt will be punished by death. The central issue of the debate, however, as you would expect, is not whether to spare the Mytileneans, but what's best for Athens, okay? Pericles had foreshadowed the moral blindness that would afflict Athens when he said, your Athenian empire is like a tyranny, okay? He's speaking as an imperialist, but a very practical one, right? It may have been wrong to take it. It is certainly dangerous to let it go. In the debate, and you can think about how Thucydides is kind of constructing this debate, Cleon even starts to echo Pericles, or maybe Pericles is starting to sound more like Cleon. If the Mytileneans were justified in revolting, then you Athenians must be wrong in holding power, okay? So they're both trying to justify their actions. In the context of empire, with so much to lose, the virtuous ruler and the demagogue then start to sound, frighteningly similar. The moral collapse of Athenian politics anticipated the moral collapse of Greek society. This is first observed in the civil war in Corcyra, which is up around where Ithaca, okay? You know who's from there, don't you? In this part of the description, fathers killed their sons, men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up in the temple of Dionysus and died there. The bonds of family were desecrated, as were all the other elements of social life, even language. So you can kind of see the destruction of the whole society happening. To fit in with the change of events, words too had to change their usual meaning. So what's the basis of social life but language, okay? And so now the words are just kind of crumbling away. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and to wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. The ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. It's a rather kind of, if Thucydides is trying to get us to understand things from different sides and at different depths, then maybe it was completely appropriate for him to be dismissed from military command. He perhaps was too thoughtful. After the death of Pericles, 2.5 years after the start of the war, the state of Athens deteriorated even more. Okay? And so Thucydides talks about how Pericles' successors start to adopt methods of demagogy, okay, which resulted in their losing control over the actual conduct of affairs. So their short-term gains as demagogues are trump any kind of long-term gains for the society. Not only did they lose control over political affairs, but they ultimately lost the basis of their empire. Private ambition and private profit led to policies which were bad, both for the Athenians themselves and for their allies. This all happens in the first phase of the war. Then we have the Peace of Nicaeus, okay, who was an Athenian general. He distinguished himself by his desire for peace. And Thucydides writes of him, of all the Hellenes of my time, he least deserved to come to so miserable an end. Athens' last hope for virtuous leadership, based on that simple way of looking at things, allowed Thucydides to state that this was a peace in name only. Okay. The Athenians weren't the only ones who disregarded the peace. Some combatants did not recognize it at all. But they were characterized, the Athenians, however, were characterized by their continuing imperial ambition, which continued to blind their sense of moderation. During the last years of the Peace of Nicaeus, the Athenians besieged the islanders of Melos. I showed you the island before, whose attempts to assert their neutrality were unacceptable. Melos refused to submit to Athenian control, and the Athenians destroyed them. And they did this acting on their principle that the strong do what they have, do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. This is not Thucydides talking. This is the Athenian speaking. The question is, what does Thucydides think about that type of remark? Had the Athenians taken advantage of the quasi-peace, to reconsider their imperial ambition, then Milos might have been saved, and Athens too perhaps would have been spared its demise, because Athens failed to understand the question from all sides, and ultimately it lost the war. It loses the war in Syracuse, in Sicily, when a general named Alcibiades tries to take the conflict there. They fail miserably, okay? And Thucydides writes, "No Hellenic army had ever suffered such a reverse. The Athenians had come to enslave others, and now they were going away frightened of being enslaved themselves." Okay? So Pericles and Alcibiades, both Athenians, okay? They're both imperialists. Pericles relied on the Athenian navy as the basis for this imperialism. Alcibiades relied on them and, in effect, sent that navy off to its destruction. In the following years, the Athens allies rebelled. They realized that the center of the empire had lost its strength once they lost their navy. And Thucydides' narrative abruptly breaks off in the following year, in 411. Okay? But we know that Sparta finally won the war 6 years later. Okay? Interestingly enough, Sparta chose not to destroy Athens, but required the surrender of whatever was left of its fleet, okay? And it ordered the destruction of its fortifications, and it granted freedom to its subject cities. So what are we to learn from Thucydides' history so that his work might last forever? There's lots of lessons, obviously. Clearly, Thucydides' history was built on a convincing method, convictions about character, had a particular vision of history, okay? It talks about the dissolution of an empire, but in the context of all those other things. Thucydides speaks of standards of character. While Athens and Sparta were the chief proponents of the Peloponnesian War, in many respects the protagonists of the history are perhaps Athens and Thucydides. Pericles' funeral oration praised Athens as a lesson for Greece. The irony of this praise in the larger context of his story is revealing. Athens was a lesson, but not in an admirable way, okay? In other words, don't follow the lesson of Athens. Human nature being what it is, and the fragile role of the noble character in human affairs makes the lesson of political ambition one that will be relevant forever. As for Thucydides, with his ability to understand a question from all sides, okay? His ability to look below the surface and understand things. He penetrated the surface of his era's moral system, and he shows the fragility of human goodness, something that we need to do perhaps, or that we do all the time, even when we don't think about it. Athens lost the war and political ambition claimed a lot of victims, but perhaps the real victim was noble character, the simple way of looking at things. Time and again in the history, he shows us that justice is honored more in speech than in action, and more by the weak than by the powerful. But, on the other hand, and a lot of people kind of promote this view, on the other hand, if you follow his standards of thoughtful judgment and character, perhaps we can sharpen our own view of humanity and achieve something in the study and practice of virtue. And in that light, then, you can learn more about virtue if you keep reading your assignments in CS. Thank you very much.